Okay, just briefly talk about plant tissue analysis. It's critical that we understand that we don't want our plants to show deficiency symptoms before we address them. And plant tissue analysis for some of the micronutrients like manganese is a good tool. I already see trees leafing out Plymouth right by my building that currently have nutrient deficient issues showing up as they've just leafed out. Uh, this So this process is just like with our soil tests. We have done research to determine what nutrient levels in the soil is needed for the plant to be productive. Now, each type of plant will have its own tissue analysis, and they always want to look at young tissue, which makes sense because some nutrients being mobile and some not being mobile. By harvesting young leaves or young whole plants, we get a good idea of the level of nutrients that are present in the plant and which ones may be deficient. A good way to know if a plant is showing some hidden hunger and like sulfur deficiency is to pull some leaves. Those growing plants in high tunnels and greenhouses hydroponically or in the soil do this on a more regular basis just because their roots are limited and the nutrient supply is controlled by them. So they monitor plant health by doing tissue analysis. But this week we're going to talk about building our soils. We have to realize that soils have formed over 500 years to create just 1 inch of topsoil. And these factors that we already talked about had a big impact on our soils. One of our issues is that humans, we change our soil structure quite completely in some situations compared to what Mother Nature produced over that long period of time. So just think about it. We change land use. We go from a natural ecosystem to housing, roads, and cities. So that soil map that I showed you within RCS will actually show you what soil was present before these things happened. But you need to take into account as a landowner how these changes impacted the soil that's currently present. We changed with drainage wetlands to gardens, which will make the organic matter more easily degraded because of the aeration of the soil compared to when it was a wetland. We change activities from a wildlife habitat to a football field. Football field has major issues because of the activity on it in a concentrated area. Forest to turf to compacted zones with limited plant growth. We have that impact as well. And then from a fertility standpoint, we're again changing the natural ecosystem into farmland, where instead of just recycling nutrients that are present, we're removing nutrients. This is true with gardens as well, that we need to account for and replenish as we remove them. Again, drainage will reduce the organic matter. Tillage of our soils will aerate the soils right after the tillage process is done. And that tillage process actually will destroy some of the soil structure present. Hopefully, as gardeners, we do it when the soil is dry. And so initially, the increased aeration will reduce the organic matter in the soil, but air and water movement can be hampered if we impact soil structure, so it doesn't allow easy flow of both. Again, I had soil tillage twice, so ignore that. Climate change, by extending the growing season with high and low tunnels, we're keeping that soil productive longer, so more nutrients are being harvested. So we need to replenish those nutrients as well, and not having a period, as long of a period for the soil to kind of heal itself, even if we're planting a cover crop into those sites. So let's talk about soil health. This is our goal. We want to build our soil. So we want the features of a healthy soil. We want that soft, crumbly, few clods, no hard pan, well drained, warms quickly in the spring, infiltration of heavy rains, little runoff. If you don't have a good soil structure, the rain will not get into your soil to replenish your water in the soil. So that's, again, we want that water going into the soil. Resist erosion and nutrient loss. Soil leaving the site takes nutrients with it. And again, we're losing that soil that takes a long time to build. High population of beneficial soil organisms that's tied to healthy soil. As soils get depleted of organic matter, the soil organisms shift to less healthy organisms and less of them. Uh, High nutrient holding capacity, crop responds to low inputs because of the fact that we build our soil. So I always say if you're going to be an organic farmer, you need to build your soils so there's nutrients present to harvest. Then that will create a soil that's highly productive because it tends to have more water available to utilize by plants during the growing season and more nutrients that can be released from the soil to feed the plants. Of course, we want to be free of harmful contaminants. So we want this good structure in our soil to where, I'm sorry, so that we have good exchange of soil gases, water, and good till for root growth. Remember, roots cannot grow through highly dense zones, so it's always good that we allow our roots to grow deep into the soil and so that they can harvest the nutrients and water present deep into the soil, not just close to the soil surface. So when we're thinking of soil ecology, we're thinking of cycling of nutrients, that's decomposition, mineralization of some of the nutrients, which will be available later, and then some energy turnover, releasing some energy to the plants and microorganisms and the things that live in your soil. The key to understand a healthy soil has a very dynamic plant, animal, and micro population living in it, which helps to do this nutrient cycling. So the diversity and abundance of life in our soil impacts our soil health. So soils are living, not inert. Just quick numbers. 1 acre of topsoil contains 900 pounds of worms, 2,400 pounds of fungi, 1,500 pounds of bacteria, 133 pounds of protozoa, and 900 pounds of arthropods and algae. So these, they depend on soil organic matter for food, except algae because it creates its own food through photosynthesis, and also interact to release nutrients and vitamins, amino acids, sugars, antibiotics, gums, and waxes. So if we have a healthy soil with a nice population of organisms, we are doing a good job of recycling our nutrients, making them available to the plants we're growing in that soil and to themselves for that matter. So when we think about organisms, the larger arthropods, sow bugs, millipedes, centipedes. Just a quick note, if you have millipedes and centipedes in your house, they're eating organic matter. That's what they feed upon. Slugs, snails, springtails. These are the first decomposers, which eat and shred large particles of plant and animal residues and will help destroy some weed seeds as well. We want organic matter on the soil surface to be turned over. That's why one component of soil health is having things, residue and plants on top of the soil surface. So these organisms have things to feed upon. So waste is rich in plant nutrients, being animal waste or plant debris. Dung beetles recycle nutrients from manure, reduce livestock intestinal parasites. So, a properly grazing system actually has livestock producing a softer manure. Hard cow pies is an indication of poor grazing. But in either case, we have these dung beagles that start recycling that manure and releasing the nutrients to be utilized in the soil environment. So preferred worms benefits, and I say preferred worms because we have worms that live at the soil surface and are quick to decompose organic matter without really making it available to other soil organisms because they live at the top of the soil. The productive worms are the ones that burrow down into the soil. So they mix and aerate our soil, decompose residue, increase nutrient availability, take nutrients down into the soil with them, plant material residue. So they improve the soil structure by creating macropores for roots and water and air to utilize to move deep into the soil, increase the infiltration of water, of course, and all of this improves plant growth. So it's a great way that an invasive animal, they're not native to America, but these invasive animals do a good job of helping to improve our soil structure and nutrient availability and water availability throughout the soil profile. So soil microorganisms are key in decomposition of residues, release plant nutrients, weathering minerals, carbon dioxide, soil humus formation as they're decomposing the organic matter. They help improve the soil structure, creating the components that help bind soils together to create those larger structures that allow air and water to move through our soil profile. Some of them fix nitrogen, taking nitrogen from the air, providing it to the plant to increase the production of plant growth. The microfacilia relationship where actually it's creating a healthier environment for soil roots and a healthier environment for the plant as well. So they're key in helping to promote plant health when we have a healthy soil. Some of them are plant pathogens, and actually that percent increases in poor soil health sites. So if you don't have a lot of active organic matter, one shift in microorganisms, there'll be a higher percent of plant pathogens compared to a healthy soil. And antibiotics produced, so they're doing some key functions in our soils that create soil health and also plant health. Bacteria is kind of one of the major ones that do a lot for us. So they're helping to make nutrients available for our plants. They release nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus, and other nutrients from the organic matter. The rhizobia are the ones that, there's different types of rhizobia bacteria, and that's why when you're growing legumes, you gotta match up the right rhizobia with the plant that you're growing so that it can have the nodulation and the infixation occurring by the rhizobia that has that positive relation, the symbiotic relationship with the plant. Soluble nutrients from the minerals, so it's helping to stabilize, solubilize nutrients, which allows some acidifying to occur, improve structure, foster. Like I was saying, they're producing compounds that help the soil particles to stay together, so that aggregation allows for soil structures that allow for good pore spaces between the soil adhering to themselves to then also those soils will hold on to some of these water and the nutrients that are cations. We can, by having a healthy soil with active organic matter, we can actually have them helping us to fight root diseases. One way that when we apply a pesticide to the soil that it breaks down is by bacteria. In fact, as we use the same type of a pesticide repeatedly over soil, we tend to develop a population of bacteria that will decompose or break down that pesticide, but also detoxifies other compounds that are in our soil. So our soil bacteria are very important in cleaning up sites that have been contaminated. And they give us the smell of soil when we're holding soil in our hands and we get excited because of that soil odor. We can thank the bacteria for giving that to us. Soil fungi will quickly colonize and break down of organic matter, so they will get on structures. And so we know we have saprophytes, which is a huge category of fungi, and they're helping to break down and recycle components that are in our soil. Doing this, they're going to release nutrients from the soil minerals, release hormones and antibiotics or predators on organisms that can hurt some of our plants, colonize roots. Again, this is a positive relationship with a fungus and our plant roots, actually enhancing the plant's roots functions and aid in the nutrient and water capture, aid in phosphorus uptake. So it's important that we have this mycorrhizal relationship with our plant roots for them to be healthy. I guess a repeat of an earlier slide. So a high population of beneficial soil organisms is key to have a healthy soil. High nutrient holding capacity. Okay, repeat, sorry. Benefits of a healthy soil: a balance of carbon to nitrogen and soil organisms lead to a rapid residue decomposing, which is good. Granulization of soil into water table aggregates, reduce erosion potential because we have soil aggregates instead of individual particles, minerals. It will decrease the crusting and clotting, improving crop emergence and root growth and penetration. I remember a farmer that tilled his soil too many times with a chisel plow when it's wet, and you could have played basketball on that soil due to the destruction of our soil structure on that upper soil. So better water infiltration, internal drainage, increases water and holding capacity, and easier to manage that soil. Poor soil will have compacted, platy structure, be low in organic matter, and lack soil organisms due to the lack of air and water movement. Soil organisms need a good environment. They need, just like our roots, the quality of aeration and nutrients. This is just an example of what happens when we destroy soil structure and do not have a good soil. We have ponding that can easily occur. Instead of the water moving into the soil, it actually is draining the soybeans growing in it. So we don't want this. We want to have good water movement through our soils. We want that crumbly upper soil profile, and we want this nice blocky structure in the B zone that allows water and air gases to move through our soils. So again, soil, I mentioned it and we'll keep mentioning it. Soil organic matter and humus are critical for soil health. Organic matter, again, is dead organisms, plant matter, and other organic matter in various stages of decomposing makes up the soil organic matter. But a healthy soil has a lot of active organic matter that's in the process of being decomposed and isn't fully decomposed. What happens when we overwork our soils and aerate them too much and destroy soil structure is that we'll still have organic matter, but it's not going to be a high percent of active organic matter that encourages microorganisms and soil health. So humus is that dark colored organic matter in final stages of decomposing, and it's quite stable, serves as a reservoir of plant nutrients and helps build soil structure. So sources of organic matter. Peat is a great one, particularly if you're growing acid-loving plants. If you're going to grow rhododendrons, azaleas, blueberries, if you did a good job of liming your soil to grow turf and you want to plant an acid-loving tree in the middle of it, you need to create a bed that includes peat to acidify that soil so that young tree that you plant has got a good source of micronutrients without you having to fertilize it. Leaves can be a good source of organic matter. It's best that we compost them or break them down. I had a person once that utilized leaves as, called it a compost, but it still looked like leaves. Compost doesn't look like what you started with. And it created layers to where nutrients couldn't move through. Leaves by themselves added to a soil is high in carbon, so it'll need nitrogen to break down, so it'll tie up soil nitrogen with the microorganisms using it to break down the leaves. So leaves are great. The best way I've seen leaves used is in the city of Bowling Green in Kentucky. They got all the southwestern Kentucky as an experiment, got all the leaves from southwest, Bowling Green, and they took them and they used a tub grinder to reduce particle size. They have a longer growing season than us. They turned them like 3 to 4 times. And then in the spring, they sold the composted leaves back to Bowling Green, and they loved it as a soil amendment. So they got paid to take them, and they sold them back to the city. A good deal for the university. Crop residue is another source of organic matter that we need to feed the microbes to break down and be active. So we don't want to remove crop residue unless we need to for disease reasons. Organic mulches are a great way to be adding organic matter to your perennial flower beds, because as that mulch breaks down, those nutrients will be released back into the soil. Compost, and we'll talk about that more in detail. Manure, and we'll cover that in more detail. And cover crops, and we'll discuss that more too. All great sources of organic matter. Again, peat, great source of not only organic matter, but a solid component that can be added to soils to help acidify our soils, which tend to be neutral, which is not good for acid-loving plants. You can get processed sludges. We have our local Plymouth, my mind just went blank. So we'll produce a processor of our city's waste. We'll land apply all the sludge that's produced. I've gotten phone calls where they're looking for sites to apply sludge. And the main concern is we don't want to apply it on the same soil. We don't want it over applied to spike any nutrient. And we want to be careful from heavy metals buildup in the soil. And that'll depend on the source of the sludge. So they should be able to give you that information if you have a large field that you would like to have it supplied to. Not a good source of organic matter in a garden. Organic fertilizers, just listing them again, just reminding you that several of these, if you use them, are also providing organic matter. Alfalfa meal, like soybean meal, fish meal, bone meal, and manure and compost are good sources of organic fertilizers that are also good tools to help build your soil organic matter. Livestock manure, this is pounds per ton wet. So if you buy livestock manure out of a store, it's been dried and composted. But when we're utilizing livestock manure, the smaller number, again, we know studying fertilizers, the first number is nitrogen, but the smaller number beside the larger number indicates what nitrogen is readily available to go into soil solution than phosphorus and potassium. So I like my sheep manure because it's more of a balanced fertilizer, because we know we use more potassium than we use phosphorus. So horse manure is good too as well. Broiler manure will tend to build up soil phosphorus if it's used to supply nitrogen to the plant, as will layer manure. And you have to note that like layer manure can be fairly hot. So there's a lot of that nitrogen available to go into the soil solution. We want to be careful when we're using it. Dairy manure is similar to cattle manure, where again, it's not that hot, and potassium's higher than the phosphorus in the manure. The layer, if you look, potassium's actually lower than phosphorus. So we want to be utilizing it in a proper fashion if we're going to utilize it. Because again, we do not want high phosphorus levels, because they will leach into our soil water and create problems in our freshwater supplies. So when we use manure, only use livestock manure. We don't want to use the obvious ones. We don't want to use as human and pet manures because of pathogens. Should be aged and composted before it's applied to the garden. It's a great addition to compost piles to increase the quality of it. If applied to a garden, should be done in the fall if you do it directly. Must wait at least 120 days after applying it to the soil before we harvest the food. If we're harvesting crops that are close to the soil or in the soil, like root crops, it should be longer than 120 days due to the pathogens. There's a potential for pathogens to live up to a year that are present in the manure, and we all hear the recalls associated with this kind of a problem, particularly on our greens that are harvested and sold. If applied directly to the soil, can attract seed corn maggots if it's applied in the spring. Another reason to apply it in the fall, the seed corn maggots, if the seed potatoes are in the soil and they're not growing rapidly, they can devastate that crop, as an example. Oh, this is tied, okay. Okay. Composting is nature's way of recycling. U.S. Environmental Protection Agency includes composting and definitions of recycling. So we're reducing materials being sent to the landfill, which is required these days. We do not want to fill our landfills up with materials that can be decomposed. Compost improves soil structure, texture, and aeration, adding that organic matter in. I always like watching a gardening show, and his first step to replanting a bed after he tills it was to put a nice layer of compost on it. And you think about areas like growing stuff in high tunnels, compost can be a good tool to replenish that soil after each crop. So what can we put in a compost pile? The question should be, what can we not put in a compost pile? So we can use dry leaves, brown, straw, wood shavings that are as another brown component. So these are high in carbon and will decompose naturally, just like I told you Western Kentucky did with the leaves from Bowling Green. It just takes longer because the nitrogen is low, so the microorganism activity will be slower because of lack of nitrogen. We can use add manure. Again, not human, pets. Pork is kind of questionable as well due to pathogens, but manure provides nitrogen if we're trying to compost a lot of browns. Grass clippings, again, can help add nitrogen to the compost pile, but The best place to leave grass clippings is on your yard. So you don't really want to promote the idea of harvesting grass clippings for the compost pile. Fresh garden weeds that not in seeds when they're still green can be added to the pile. But you want to, if we get any seeds or diseases from what we add to our compost pile, we'll be sure to make sure we do an active composting where the compost heats up to kill those pathogens. Food scraps, excluding meats and fats. I don't know if anyone remembers a period in time that the landfill just south of Marshall County and Fulton County was making people sick because they were getting meats and fats from large cities like Chicago. We were attempting to compost them, but it was not an effective compost system. It was putting out an odor that was horrendous. So we don't want to do that in our backyards. Fresh compost or soil to make sure we're adding some microorganisms. We don't need to buy them. We can get them from our soil or from our fresh compost that we just completed. We can add nitrogen fertilizer again if we need more nitrogen to speed up the compost. It doesn't take a lot to add to a 3 by 3 by 3 pile, but that can be a source to help speed things up. I also say that if you have a stump in your yard, drill holes into it and put nitrogen into it if you want it to break down quicker. Because a stump's going to have it needs water to go into the stump, and it also need to get the nitrogen into the stump to activate microorganisms. So this is a great source of organics. We're taking household waste into valuable organic fertilizer, and it can be, again, some yard waste as well, depending on what we're adding to it, and definitely leaves and things like that. I have we'll talk about companion gardening next week, but I have the author of a book that I have would actually stop in the fall with bags, trash bags, and harvest other people's leaves to use in her garden. So we need about 30 parts of dry browns to 1 part greens, a ratio of about 3 to 1. Nothing magical about that ratio. It just at that ratio, it tends to move at a faster pace if you have adequate nitrogen. We want a good size so that we will get some good warming, and that's why we need some adequate nitrogen in the compost pile if we're adding in garden waste that could be a source of seeds or diseases. We want to make sure it's at least 3 by 3 or 3 or about 27 cubic feet size of that. So that will encourage that warmer situation, which will speed composting. So the speed of composting, I'll touch upon this again, is really a factor of 4 things. Particle size, that's why Bowling Green leaves were shredded before they were put into a compost pile to reduce particle size, as well as the carbon to nitrogen ratio, having adequate nitrogen to break down the carbon, having the right moisture. Just like many things, we want it to be the consistency of a wrung out sponge. Moisture present, but we don't want it saturated. An anaerobic system of composting would actually put out odors. And then we want to make sure we have proper aeration. So it's an active process or an aerobic process, not an anaerobic. So what problems can we have in composting? Compost has a bad odor, not enough air. You're doing an anaerobic process, so it needs to be turned. And that's why having something over the compost structure can help you manage the water. Center of the pile is dry, not enough water, so we may need to moisten the pile to get some moisture in there so organisms can be active in that compost, decomposing it. Damp and warm only in the middle. We may have too small of a pile. The pile is damp and sweet, but still not heating up. It may be lacking the nitrogen. So we could add some, mix in some nitrogen source such as grass clippings, or even add a little nitrogen fertilizer on the top. If you allow rain to help keep it moist, it'll work down through the compost pile as nitrogen moves. The other situation could be we actually have too much nitrogen, and that'll put out an odor as well. So a good compost pile should be heating up, not have a lot of odor to it. And we just need to remember to turn it occasionally to help turn what's on the edges to the center so the heat can take out the problems in that as well. So compost bin, barrels can come in many. I have to laugh. My son did research. He's an engineer, and he was getting PVC pipe to put into the center of his compost pile with holes in the PVC pipe to aerate the center. He was doing all these math equations. And I said, Ben, you live in southern Indiana. Just go out to the farm fields. There'll be old woven wire fences laying around. Use that, because a lot of air will get in through that woven wire fence, and you don't have to be that complicated. That's okay. He makes a lot more money than me, so I can't say anything negative about his engineering thinking. It's paid off well for him and his family. But we can use pallets, old woven wire, old windbreak type fencing, chicken wire. Trash cans have to have holes drilled into them to allow them to be aerated. That's what the nice ones that you buy to do this. Manufactured bins will have nicely perforated areas so that it will stay aerated. And they'll have lids on them so you can manage the moisture in it. I borrowed this slide from a presentation of a master gardener.
Just dump whatever you have into the compost bin as you make your waste. Or use the layering method. Alternate layers of greens and browns. Or the third method is mixing your compost as you add it to the bin, so that you're always turning the compost. Your bin can take as long as 2 months to as long as 1 year to result in a rich, valuable compost.
So the dump and run method will actually be the one that takes a year, so you're not really managing it. You're just letting the pile break down, but as Mother Nature does, it will break down. The layering method is trying to keep an even mixture of both, but it will need to be turned as well to move nutrients into the center so that the heating can occur if it's an active compost system. And the mixing method is that we're just mixing as we're going, adding in the compost to make sure that we're getting that nitrogen compost source mixed in with the high carbon sources. Speed, not seed, of composting relates to particle size, as I said, carbon and nitrogen ratio, moisture and aeration. Another thing that we can do is worm composting of organic waste. It's not a complicated process. You just need to get the right worm, red wigglers that are commonly used for fishing. Those type of worms, you can order them or find them outside. And they can, if you have the right structure, it can just be a plastic bin that you just put in some shredded paper and then moisten it, add the worms, and add a little waste. You gotta be careful that you don't overwhelm them with waste. And you want drainage holes on the bottoms and something to capture the liquid coming out, because that can be utilized to fertilize your house plants. So we can even use worms on the inside and compost, and just use your standard storage bins. The size will be dependent on how much waste that you're producing, and you can do it that way as well. One concern in adding grass clippings before I leave composting is to make sure that they have not had a herbicide applied to them. Because if you're doing active composting, that herbicide could have some activity in the compost as you're applying it to your gardens that would be sensitive to it. So be sure to Manage herbicide applications to your turf if you're going to be saving some of the grass clippings to use for composting. So it's not happening right before you're mowing and keeping the clippings to add. So cover crops have a lot of benefits for soil fertility and water quality. This is a great way to reduce erosion and water and wind from your garden site over the winter time, increase soil organic matter throughout the soil profile, capture and recycle and redistribute nutrients. If you don't have a real issue on loss of nutrients from our soils is the fact that they tend to be released in the spring as the water flows out of our fields and tile lines, and there's nothing to take it out of the soil, so it ends up in our surface water. So if we have something growing roots in the soil to help harvest these nutrients as they're being released from the organic matter as the soil warms up in the spring, it's a great thing to help capture those nutrients then too. So we provide biological nitrogen fixation if we're using legumes as a cover crop. We're improving soil physical conditions, aggregation, compaction, reducing that, and moisture management, because what's nice about a cover crop, if it's growing in your garden space that you want to garden in the spring, you can stop the plant's growth as needed to manage the water in the soil. You'll let them grow longer if the soil is wet. If it's a dry spring, you want to terminate the cover crop quicker before it robs the soil moisture down deep in the soil by harvesting it through the root system it's developed. It's a great tool to help with weed suppression, biodiversity of plants growing in your soil to help with the biodiversity of the microorganisms that live in your soil, and can be a source of actually harvesting some green material to add to your compost pile too in the spring of the year. So we can have cover crops that do a couple things for us. These can grow effectively to be a barrier. Oats planted in the fall of the year will actually grow and give us good biomass. Spring oats, when it gets cold, will actually die, so there's nothing to terminate in the spring of the year. So that's good for management. Winter peas will be a legume if we have adequate time for them grow to produce some good nitrogen, as is red clover. And there's other clovers other than just red clover. There's multiple legumes in the clover family that we can utilize. So if you have a garden space where you're growing sweet corn, when that sweet corn's done, you can be working in some legumes where that corn was, because that corn is a nutrient robber of our soils, so it can be adding nutrients back into the soil. Again, just showing here that weeds can be effective as a weed suppressor. I have this slide in here to highlight rye. So cereal rye, if we crimp it over, you can actually get it to work as a mat, if you will, become actually a natural mulch. So if we get cereal rye and we crimp it as it's starting to head, or lay it down, like you've seen those photos from Europe a lot, where those circles are out in the wheat fields. We do that to our rye at the right time, it'll actually become a living, organic mulch for us, and be returning all those nutrients back to the soil. So trap nutrients that would otherwise leak out is one function. So these will reduce what's leaching out of our soil and losses that are eroded from soil or runoff. As those roots in the soil break down and the part of the plant above the soil breaks down, it'll release those nutrients back into the next crop, which growing in your garden, for example. But it'll do it based upon what the carbon to nitrogen ratio is present in that cover crop. So if it's higher in nitrogen in the cover crop tissue, They'll tend to break down quicker than things like cereal rye, which tend to be high in carbon. The legumes can, again, fix our nitrogen, translocate nutrients deeper into the subsoil as the roots grow down. That will not only create channels for water and roots of your next crop to grow into the soil, they'll move organic matter down deep into the soil, helping with biological activity by getting air and nutrients and water down into the soil. Cover crops do not create nutrients, they just help us with the recycling. So when you're looking at a system, you want to choose a cover crop that best fits what your desired goal is. Do you want something that can be a green manure to help increase your health of your soil? Do you want it to be a crop to catch crop nutrients? Do you want a taproot? I mean, we have tillage radishes that actually are edible, but they also do a great job of growing deep into the soil, making large openings to allow water and nutrients to flow down. So the ideal fall cover crop would be spring oats and tillage radishes, because both will naturally terminate when it gets really cold, and also provide that residue and move nutrients down deep into the soil. A fallow crop is an area that you just don't grow something in during the growing season, and you get a nice mixture of a cover crop to grow in that space. So if you have a large garden, you may want to rebuild some of your garden soil each year by rotating to a cover crop during the whole growing season. I should note that some cover crops, such as cereal rye, have allopathic effects, so they help reduce some negative soil organisms. One would be cyst nematodes, and I was amazed when a farmer that had high soybean cyst nematodes rotated that crop one year just to grow cereal rye. He harvested the rye seed to use to plant cereal rye, but the drop in soybean cyst nematodes numbers were just simply amazing. It was a major drop at a major significant level. Again, this is kind of the area here. You would just have crops growing in a bed, and you'd have one area that you plant to a season-long cover crop to enrich that soil. So like if you're growing sweet corn or another one of the crops that will tend to rob the soil a lot of nutrients, that would be the place that you would allow to be fallow the following season, incorporate a biodiversity of multiple cover crops to grow during the growing season. So legumes will fix nitrogen. We already mentioned that. Legumes are mainly used to trap nitrogen. The other nutrient that cover crops can trap that moves in our soil profile is sulfur. So we have to remember that now that we manage our sulfur output by when coal is burnt, we capture it. Our soils can have limited levels of sulfur, and that can be a limiting nutrient that needs to be captured as well. Non-legumes do not contribute in through bacterial fixation, but they do capture nutrients that will be released to the plant later. They will help with managing weed issues as well. Over time, cover crops can add, as green manure crops, can add organic matter content to the soil and build the nutrient content. So adding this active organic matter to a soil is going to create a soil that's going to be more resilient to issues that can impact plant growth. It's going to be less compacted. It's going to have a nice nutrient supply to feed the next crop as that organic matter increases in the soil. It's released to the plants. There's less nutrients and organic matter increase of the cover crops. This wasn't edited, it should have been. Cover crops are harvested. So if, so the ideally in a garden space, we want to leave the whole plant in the garden so we can recycle the nutrients as we did in our natural ecosystems before we started gardening the soil. So that we're cycling a lot more nutrients in that space. But it's amazing what can be accomplished. It's on a per acre basis, but you can, particularly if you do that green manure for a significant part of the growing season at least, you can get upwards of 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre produced. 40 to 60% of nitrogen available to the subsequent crop when it's the cover crop is terminated. And we can, incorporation of green manure into the soil results in an increase of N for 4 to 6 weeks after the supplemental N may be required, depending on the needs of the crop. But you're moving a lot of nutrients back into the soil. And we build our soil organic matter. There'll be soil organic matter in our soil, in addition to the green manure that will be releasing nitrogen during the growing season as well. So when we're looking at different crops that we can use, what we'd use in our garden space would be more like red clover. We could use cowpeas, vetches, but you can see the roots can have a significant amount of the plant nitrogen as compared to the tops, depending on what we decide to grow. So looking at clovers, we can have as much as 32% of the plant nitrogen located in the root system. Alfalfa is expensive to grow as a cover crop. That's why I'm not talking really about alfalfa, but there's nothing wrong with it, but may not be the best. So looking at some other cover crops we can utilize, crimson clover is another cultivar, and buckwheat can be a common one that we use. It gets some good growth. If you let it go to seed, you can make your own buckwheat pancakes too. Again, looking at biomasses, again, looking at what we would use, we could sweet clover, different kinds of clovers. You can see pounds per acre. We can produce a lot if we have an extended period to grow it. If we wait until we harvest all of our vegetables, plant in the fall, and start gardening early in the season, the amount that's going to be produced is not going to be close to these numbers because we don't have time for those legumes to grow long enough to produce these levels. Even farmers that are using cover crops, that's always a challenge when they're using legumes, is trying to get them planted timely enough to really get the benefit compared to the cost of the legume. So for home gardeners, I kind of like the oats and tillage radishes or cereal rye or something, if we're going to not be allowing it to grow for an extended period of time, so that we're not investing in seed that's not going to give back nutrients like nitrogen because of the limited time that we allow them to grow, to have a longer growing season to enjoy our garden space. Again, that fallow area is a good way to take advantage of legumes. This is just showing you that you can, between sweet corn or other crops, plant not just red clover, but a couple other kinds of cultivar clovers on the soil. If we till between our vegetable crops to manage weeds, we can stop tilling and then plant these. So our real challenge is having a long enough growing season to produce enough biomass to justify planting a legume in our climate. Good results if we would live in Kentucky, for example, where they have a warmer winter period to allow legumes to be more actively producing nitrogen with that rhizobia relationship on the root system. So we need, in addition to cover crops, we got to remember what we talked about earlier, is there's other sources of organic matter, but compost and other amendments to our garden spaces can help. If you're doing perennial plants, then using organic mulches can help in adding organic matter to those sites since we can't be planting cover crops readily between them. Now, who knows? If you have some asparagus and you want to try working some legumes in between the asparagus roots, since we no longer use salt to control weeds with asparagus, you may be able to get a little cover crop action going on those as well. So just be creative on how you can work in some cover crops into your landscape. Look at that, the biodiversity in this cover crop. We got some grasses and legumes growing there. And if we have a long enough period of times for this cover crop to grow, it's going to be building our soil by putting in channels that water and nutrients can follow, and also get organic matter down into the soil with the roots of these cover crop. And those roots can help break up the soil profile. You can use, we get annual rye is a cover crop we can utilize. My concern for home gardeners with annual rye is terminating it, and it can be hard if you're not careful to terminate it. So if you want to try some annual rye as a cover crop, use it in a small area first and determine how you're going to terminate it. I already said we could use spring oats and tillage radishes in the fall and have Mother Nature terminate them for us. Or our soil rye, we can actually use it as a organic mulch after it's done being our cover crop. If you crimp it at the right time of its plant's life. It's when it's just heading out is the time to do it, for it to be crimped and no longer growing. So trap crops, the amount of biomass produced is key to nutrient uptake. Good stand and rapid growth is what we want. I already mentioned that plant skill determines the nitrogen level, the carbon and nitrogen level in the plant composition will determine how readily those nutrients are released back to the soil environment. And we already mentioned cereal rye, annual ryegrass, wheat, oats, and barley are good trap crops that we can use in our gardens. These seeds are readily available. Again, my caution with annual ryegrass is that termination aspect of that one. It tends to be a fairly aggressive plant. That's why we use it sometimes as a forage crop for livestock, because it gives a good return on how aggressively it grows. So when we're thinking of a trap crop, again, we just want those roots to intercept soluble nutrients in the soil solution before they leach out. This is showing all nitrogen, but that could be sulfur as well, which is another one that we lose the soil leaching. So this is just demonstrating again, utilizing ryegrass. They use manure, but they had a biomass that was significant produced with that cover crop. In Fulton County is just the ryegrass, and we still got 12.8 pounds of nitrogen per acre captured and saved from leaching. And similar results in Jennings County, where they actually had 27.7 biomass. Here, ours will be less because our soils are not going to be as active in the winter as in the southern part of our state, but our cover crops will still capture leaching nutrients, particularly in the spring months before we have an opportunity to prepare our soils to plant the next garden vegetable crop. Again, this is a picture of ryegrass, and you can see how it can be suppressing. I mean, rye, this is cereal rye. It's good at suppressing weed growth, so it helps manages weeds so you don't have to deal with them during the growing season. Again, this is just showing carbon and nitrogen ratio in different types of cover crops, which is tied to how rapidly they will be releasing nutrients back after you terminate them. So you can see a young rye plant is fairly high. Legumes are fairly high in nitrogen to carbon, low in carbon to nitrogen. It's another way to say it. But then you see corn stalks and sawdust, how long it will take for them to recycle nutrients back to the soil, and why that if you're using these in compost, why you're going to need a nitrogen source to have a more rapid breakdown in a compost pile. Because if you're putting sawdust as part of your browns into a sawdust pile, you're going to need some greens to help break it down. And this could be wood shavings too. Not just sawdust, if we have a similar carbon to nitrogen ratio. We can have beds that we're growing plants, and in between those, we can plant a living plant between the rows. We just need to manage the height of that plant so it doesn't compete with what we're growing. But that can be helping to add some organic matter back to the soil. This is just showing some nutrient levels of the various crops as they grow and capture nutrients that can be released back to our plants. They can help with removing some phosphorus. This is magnesium, which is, again, a macronutrient, and calcium, and potassium presence in those crops, in addition to nitrogen. So growing these will actually we'll be harvesting some nutrients to help with nutrient cycling in our soil by having them present in these cover crops. So we can keep a more of a natural process going of returning nutrients to the soil. So from a water quality standpoint, having the thing that we do as gardeners too is we have rain beds to do the same thing to help capture nutrients before water leaches into the soil and into our surface water as it exits. So it helps with that. Reduced. So the effectiveness is the quality of the stand and the rapid biomass production. So our issue can be when we're done with our garden spaces, we may not be ready to plant a cover crop before it's starting to cool off. Good garden space where you garden in the seasons using low tunnels can delay when you're planting cover crops, obviously. So trap crops can absorb indefinitely as nutrients are released into the soil water. They grow some crops we use. We even talk about hemp being a trap crop to help clean up sites that are contaminated with chemicals, because it's good at searching the soil and bringing in organisms out of the soil solution. So hemp may have another use, and trust me, that hemp you would not want to use for yourself in any fashion after it's done harvesting toxic chemicals out of the soil. But it's a good scavenger that way too. So actually, hemp is a good cover crop. Anyway, since I'm already over, I kind of covered these points. I just want to note, if you want to learn about cover crops, there's a great site called the Midwest Cover Crop Council. It has information about what a cover crop is, but more importantly, it has a cover crop decision tool that you can go and utilize and put your information in. It'll ask for you to select the county you live in. That'll determine when you can plant cover crops based upon our climate. Tell us, your goals. So do you want it to be a trap crop? Do you want it to be green manure to help increase it? So it's a tool that you can go to, just like the NRCS soil webpage, to glean information that you can utilize if you try and use cover crops. But our goal is to incorporate our organic matter back into the soil at a higher rate than we're removing it, because the key to improved soil health is increased organic levels. And what I get excited about with master gardeners when I get their soil test, a lot of times their organic matter is at or above 5% organic matter. So that tells me they're doing this already, adding soil amendments such as compost and other organic sources of material to increase the organic matter level in their soils. So we can build our soils. The key is organic matter and selecting the organic matter that works with the type of gardening you do. Obviously, perennial beds, they'd be more of organic mulches and things along that sort to help add the organic matter there. Is there any questions?